Many of the chemicals we come in contact with can be hazardous. Formaldehyde, a common laboratory substance, is no exception. When we're around it, we need to be careful. Health problems from mishandling formaldehyde can be serious. They range from the short-term discomfort of minor burns or skin irritation to chronic effects from a lifetime of overexposure.
The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, has issued an updated standard for working safely with materials that contain formaldehyde. The standard includes a list of health problems associated with overexposure to formaldehyde. Symptoms are easy to recognize. External contact may cause short-term irritation to the skin, eyes, and mucous membranes. Inhalation of formaldehyde gas or vapors can induce coughing, nausea, violent vomiting, diarrhea, and laryngitis. Breathing in extremely high concentrations of formaldehyde can bring on convulsions, coma, or death. The effects of long-term exposure to high levels of formaldehyde may not immediately appear, but in time, very serious problems can develop. For instance, formaldehyde is a suspected carcinogen and mutagen. Overexposure increases the risk of developing cancer. Formaldehyde is also a chronic toxin. Repeated or prolonged exposure may result in permanent respiratory damage. If you think you're developing symptoms of overexposure, immediately report them to your supervisor.
Those are some of the health hazards associated with the mishandling of formaldehyde. Let's take a look at ways to protect ourselves from these problems.
We need to monitor the amount of formaldehyde that we're exposed to. Employers will test the air in our immediate work area by taking individual samples. They'll compare the test result to OSHA's new permissible exposure limit for formaldehyde, a figure expressed in parts per million. OSHA has reduced this permissible exposure limit, or PEL, from 1 part per million to 0.75 parts per million. This limit is calculated for an 8-hour time-weighted average of exposure. Your facility will measure the amount of formaldehyde in your immediate work area to arrive at an 8-hour average of exposure. This amount is then compared to OSHA's permissible exposure limit of 0.75 parts per million. You'll need to take special precautions if the average level of formaldehyde in the air reaches or exceeds the PEL. For some tasks, an 8-hour average of exposure may mask the presence of temporarily high levels of formaldehyde. To further prevent overexposure, OSHA has also determined short-term exposure limits, or STELs. These limits are based on an exposure period of 15 minutes. OSHA's short-term exposure limit for formaldehyde is set at an exposure level of no more than 2 parts per million.
I know this may seem like a lot of numbers, but exposure limits have been set up for your protection. Make sure that you pay attention to them. If you have any questions, see your supervisor.
The formaldehyde standard also contains training regulations to help keep us better informed. Because the health effects of formaldehyde can be very serious, OSHA requires annual training for all employees who are exposed to levels of 0.1 parts per million or higher. So for starters, we need to know where formaldehyde is used in our workplace and how we can limit hazardous exposure. Proper labeling plays a major role in providing information on the hazards of formaldehyde. Mixtures and solutions containing more than 0.1% formaldehyde must state specifically that formaldehyde is present and that physical and health hazard information is available from the employer and the MSDS. This is also true for any material capable of releasing formaldehyde into the air at concentrations of 0.1 parts per million or higher. Mixtures and solutions containing more than 0.5% formaldehyde and materials capable of releasing 0.5 parts per million of formaldehyde must, at a minimum, be labeled with the following warnings. sensitization of the skin and respiratory system, eye and throat irritation, acute toxicity, and cancer. These labels must specifically state that formaldehyde is a potential cancer hazard. If this information cannot fit on the label itself, then the label will direct you to other sources of information. For instance, labels will often lead you to formaldehyde's material safety data sheet. The MSDS will tell you how to avoid problems while working with formaldehyde.
The most basic way of shielding yourself from hazardous levels of exposure is through personal protective equipment.
Gloves are a good place to start. Protective gloves are often designed for use with specific substances or hazards. For maximum protection, OSHA requires you to choose gloves that are impervious to formaldehyde solutions of 1% or more. Solutions containing more than 1% formaldehyde require splash-resistant goggles that provide complete protection for the eyes. With some jobs, a face shield may also be required to protect your skin, but don't consider face shields as a substitute for goggles. Even with a face shield, goggles are required if there's any danger of formaldehyde reaching the area of the eye. Where formaldehyde gas is present, it may be necessary for you to work with a full-face air purifying respirator. See your supervisors. They'll tell you about your employer's respiratory protection program, which includes the proper selection, training, and fit testing of respirators. Training and fit tests must be performed whenever a new respirator is given out, and at least once a year thereafter. You'll also be given the appropriate filtering cartridge for the work you're doing. Your supervisor will tell you how often these need to be replaced. Lab coats are designed to help shield you from splash liquids. These and all other protective clothing must be impervious to water when you're working with formaldehyde solutions. If your clothing becomes contaminated, dispose of it in your company's authorized disposal area. Another important part of working safely is following proper work practices.
Hey, Bernie.
For instance, when you're asked to wear personal protective equipment, then do it. It's extremely important that you follow all of your lab's recommended procedures. They're set up for your protection. As we mentioned before, maintaining proper ventilation is one of the most important safe work practices. Make sure you use lab hoods and other ventilation devices to keep the formaldehyde in the air out of your breathing zone. And follow all the rules for the safe use of these devices.
After all the necessary precautions have been taken, we still need to be mindful of accidents. No matter how careful we are, things can go wrong.
We need to be prepared so that we can minimize the effects of any mishaps that occur. Your employer has developed a plan for dealing with accidents. In the event of a small spill, soak up the formaldehyde with an absorbent material. Place the waste into a properly labeled and sealed container for later disposal. Do not attempt to handle large spills of formaldehyde. They should only be dealt with by properly protected and trained personnel. This substance is toxic and can overwhelm you. Alert other workers in the area. Vacate the laboratory immediately and call for assistance. In case of limited contact with formaldehyde, it's important to act quickly. For skin contact, immediately remove all contaminated clothing. Wash the affected area with soap or mild detergent and large amounts of water for at least 15 to 20 minutes. If the area of contact is large, get to a safety shower. Remove all clothing and stay under the water for the same amount of time. Be sure to get medical attention after any contact. If formaldehyde splashes into your eyes, water is again the first line of defense. Immediately go to your lab's eye wash station and wash the formaldehyde out of your eyes with large amounts of water for a minimum of 15 minutes. Seek medical attention. If someone accidentally swallows formaldehyde, immediately provide them with drinking water. Keep them warm and calm and get medical attention as soon as possible. In the event that someone inhales formaldehyde gas, immediately remove the person from the exposure area and get them to fresh air. Then quickly call for an ambulance. Keep the victim warm and calm until medical help arrives. Be careful when responding to any of these situations. Don't enter areas that have high concentrations of formaldehyde. Wait for rescuers with appropriate respiratory protection to arrive. Another way the formaldehyde standard helps ensure employee health and safety is through the Medical Surveillance Plan. This plan is designed to ensure the safety of employees who come into contact with formaldehyde. Under the plan, workers who are adversely affected by the chemical will be given a temporary work assignment with reduced exposure to formaldehyde. A decision will later be reached as to whether the affected employee should return to their old position, remain in the temporary job, or whether other options must be considered. If you have any questions about formaldehyde exposure, be sure to see your supervisor.
We can work safely with formaldehyde by following proper work practices. Be aware of the materials that contain formaldehyde in your work area. Use proper personal protective equipment and be prepared in case of a spill or other accident. Remember, participating in the required training and complying with the new standard will make working with formaldehyde safer and easier for everyone.